Thank you for joining us for this webinar from the Education Writers Association. The topic is covering student absenteeism in the COVID-19 era. I'm Eric Robelin, EWA's Deputy Director, and I will be moderating this discussion today. Before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, please type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel and include your name and affiliation. Ask your question at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A later on in the conversation. As soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete the survey. Your feedback is really important to us and helps us to improve. So our goal today in this webinar is to give busy education reporters the grounding they need to tell the story or stories of students missing from school in the pandemic, whether sporadically or all the time. This includes students in virtual school as well as hybrid or fully in-person school, because we know that all three are taking place in different parts of the country. We will offer a quick primer on chronic absenteeism, advice on where to turn for data and how to interpret that data, plus some of the key questions to be asking. And we'll also provide advice on how to find, quote, lost students and their families, and much more too beyond that. So we have two fantastic and accomplished presenters today. We have Hedy Chang, the president of Attendance Works, a national research and advocacy group focused on addressing chronic absenteeism. Hedy brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table, and we're thrilled to have her. We also have Abby Goodenough, a national healthcare correspondent at the New York Times, but Abby periodically writes education stories and has also covered the beat in the past. And just recently, she wrote an excellent piece. It was published last week with the headline, "As Schools Go Remote, Finding Lost Students Gets Harder." It's also great to have her for this webinar or connecting with us because, as we all know, the education and health beats have collided like never before during the pandemic. So we're really happy to have her and may find an opportunity in the future to have her back. So with that, I'm going to start with Hedy Chang from Attendance Works is going to give some opening remarks and show some slides. And then Abby will also share some opening thoughts before we get into a conversation. So Hedy, please take it away.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We work at the local, state, and national level, and I think that's one of the reasons why this has been such an incredible, it's an incredible opportunity to talk with all of you and to share the knowledge that we're gaining. You know, one of the things, I know equity matters a ton for all of you journalists. It matters for us, but one thing to think about is this is an important issue to cover because absenteeism, not showing up, is truly a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. We have a wealth of research that shows this. And the thing, though, that we want to think about is that absenteeism is actually made up of multiple metrics. And the term that Attendance Works has been working on for the last decade was actually a relatively new unknown metric. A relatively unknown metric that now is part of our national dialogue. So let me just talk about these different metrics for a moment, though. Typically, people had looked at average daily attendance, which is how many kids show up to school every day, or they looked at truancy. Who's missing school without permission? And that actually can connect into court intervention eventually. And it's defined differently, by the way, by every state, and some states leave it up to localities to define. Chronic absence is a metric that has really come into being in the last few years, particularly with ESSA, and it's typically defined as missing 10% or more of school for any reason, and this is where the research shows there is an impact on educational outcomes, and prior to COVID-19, estimates were about there were 8 million kids chronically absent. Now, under ESSA, which really made this national policy, chronic absence actually is required to be reported to the federal government but under state plans for implementing ESSA, 36 states plus Washington, D.C. actually adopted chronic absence as an accountability metric. That was waived last spring, but it is not currently waived. So that is still in play.
And if I can interrupt for 1 second, Hetty, just most members will know this, but just the ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act, the main federal law for K-12 education that replaced No Child Left Behind. I think it was adopted in like 2015, if memory serves. So that's kind of the main law that has strings attached to the funding that goes out, including things like demonstrating your plans for accountability. And a lot of states then are using chronic absenteeism as part of their accountability plan, right?
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, it is what guides federal funding to states who then in turn use it. And it's usually used for your highest poverty, lowest performing schools. So the thing that we know about absenteeism is it is a sign that positive conditions for learning are not in place, whether school is in person or whether it's remote. Kids come to school when these things are in place. They feel physically and emotionally healthy and safe. And frankly, families need to feel this is true for their kids as well. When kids feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support. Now, these 4 circles were actually a framework that we had developed prior to COVID-19, but it still holds true now. And one of the challenges of COVID-19 is, so we closed schools to make sure that people would stay healthy and safe, and we're reopening schools. And sometimes when chronic absence is happening or absenteeism in general, kids aren't showing up, it's actually because one or more of these conditions don't exist. They don't actually feel safe returning to school. When you have online school, bullying is happening. Kids don't feel emotionally healthy and safe and secure in their classroom. They don't feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support. We are inventing school in a way that we've never tried to invent in so many different modalities before. We need to notice when kids are not showing up because it is one of the earliest warning signs that we fail to put in place these positive conditions of learning. And we need to notice that right away so we can take steps so that kids don't lose out on the opportunity to learn and don't experience further learning loss. Now, it's helpful maybe as education reporters for you to understand there are really multiple purposes for which attendance data has historically been used. Some of it has been around allocating funding. About 6 states in the country actually use that. California, Texas, Kentucky are some of the most well-known. It has also been, as we talk about truancy, for ensuring compliance with compulsory ed. As we talked about with ESSA, it has been around school accountability. Right now, though, what we believe the most important focus of data should be is around early warning to activate additional supports for particular kids and for really informing policy and program, because it is your first indication that things are gone awry and need to change. And so that's something for you to think about, though, because sometimes these purposes are conflicting. So in Mississippi, for example, and there were a couple other places that did this too, they fund based on average daily attendance. So in the spring, when they closed schools, the solution by schools was to always say kids were present. It's not because they didn't want to do early warning, it's because they were worried about funding. So as an education reporter, it may be helpful to think about these things. We do think we really need to use data to identify our kids who are at risk, whether they were chronically absent in the past, but then we also need to look at things like, do they have working contact information? Are kids getting connected? Do they have relationships with the people in their school? And now, are they participating or not? And you want to almost think about these first 4 hexagons as prerequisites for the little or no, for what's happening around participation. And when you have all of the information in place and when districts can tell you this, it gives you a sense of what might be going on that might be causing kids not to be in school and to be losing out on learning time. So I just wanted to also offer up that we have some real suggestions for you to consider. One is you should ask your districts and states for their current attendance or participation rates. What do they know now? Now, one of the things you should know is not every state in the country has mandated that you take daily attendance. It is one of the challenges I never imagined I would experience, that we'd go from a time where taking daily attendance in schools was the norm to it being something that might be even considered optional. And by asking folks, what are their attendance participation rates? How many kids are showing up every day? You help to make sure that people, you get that data. And there are some places, by the way, that put kinds of participation rates and attendance rates on their websites. Usually that's been year-end data, but a few places like Oakland, for example, has started to put how many kids are absent and how many days of absences and how many days of attendance are they seeing. And you can use that. When you look at people's data, though, you should ask them, how are they defining and counting attendance for in-person, for remote, whether that's synchronous or asynchronous learning? Because this is another thing that has really changed. Folks know how to take attendance in person. What is less clear is when do you say a kid's there when it's synchronous learning, or even more unclear when it's asynchronous. You also can find out from your state, look on your state website, what kind of guidance are they offering? It's pretty variable. And often, though, there is a district that's making decisions about how do they count when kids are there or not. One of the challenges we have is I think we have pretty low bars for what's counting kids as there. That's okay, but we have to understand then that if kids aren't there, that we really need to be concerned. And we're going to have to monitor over time whether or not participation rates start to fail over time or start to decrease because we aren't actually engaging kids in a meaningful way. Look at this data disaggregated. We're seeing, it's actually hard to know what data is that is out there right now because this is really a whole new world of attendance taking. But remember that averages mask differences. So you can see, let's say 92% attendance for an entire school district, but what it's masking is really low levels of, much lower levels of attendance for particular ethnic groups, for English language learners, for kids in special ed, by kids in particular grades. And the other thing I would just say is that it can have real value if you can make sure you can also use the data not only to identify where there are challenges, but where there are bright spots. And then use that information to help folks see what is it that folks are doing that can be replicated elsewhere. And we've seen amazing bright spots. We need those stories of hope to keep us seeing what is possible. And finally, making sure that you can both use data, education, health, other kinds of data, along with the voices of youth and families to help unpack what are the barriers that keep kids from getting to school. One last just thing, we're going to send this out, but I have lots of other information that just gives a little bit more depth on some of these concepts, and those will be available after the webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Hetty. Yeah, they have a wealth of resources, really a great place to get some good information and for follow-up as well. Abby, can you please talk a little bit about your story, how you did it, you know, what you learned, that sort of thing?
Sure. Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank you for having a healthcare reporter come in to talk to your education group. It's a little humbling. I last covered education around 2003 or 4. I covered the New York City schools for about 5 years and have not really dipped back into it since then, except through the experience of my own kids here in Washington, D.C., where I live. So, you know, just watching the experience on the ground here through DCPS had made me really curious about the attendance issue and the absenteeism issue. And when one of the education editors coaxed me to come back and do some kind of freelance education stories, this is one that I really leapt to do. Just for one thing, because as Eric was pointing out, there are so many overlaps right now between education and the healthcare beat. And the inequities issue is such a big piece for both. So this just kind of was what I was really curious about. And the first step I took was to call Hetty, who just told me everything that she just told you guys and gave me a great grounding in definitions of attendance and truancy and chronic absenteeism pre-COVID, and how we were trying to redefine them during COVID, and how much just on how little data we have, how many questions we have. So she was a really excellent starting place. And the biggest challenge, I guess, was finding a bunch of teachers' voices on the ground who could talk to me what their experiences had been, both in the spring and at the very beginning of the school year, because for some of them, when I first reached out, the school year hadn't even started yet. So luckily, I did this story on and off over a couple of weeks. And by the time I finished, almost all of the teachers I had talked to had started school. And some were a couple of weeks in, some were a month in, and had some good feedback for me on attendance. The way that I found teachers was, I'm embarrassed to say, it was pretty easy, because the New York Times periodically puts out what we call call outs to readers, targeting different types of readers and different jobs or different age groups. And our education newsletter had put out a call out sometime in August to teachers. I think asking them kind of a broad set of questions about their concerns about heading into the new school year. But there were maybe 100 teachers, maybe a little more, who had answered. So I just ended up emailing and calling a bunch of them and seeing who had good stories or input. And I ended up getting a nice sample that way from around the country. Normally, as a beat reporter for healthcare, I have a bunch of different networks I can tap into to say, do you know anybody who can share their story with me? As somebody who doesn't cover education right now, I didn't have those networks at my fingertips. So the call out was a really great way to quickly connect with teachers. So that is how I connected. Much harder, and not something I accomplished in this particular story, is the challenge of connecting with students and parents who are having trouble getting to school. And that's something I'm still thinking about and still really interested in doing. But during the pandemic in particular, it's a steep challenge. So I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on that, and happy to share my own about some ideas that I've not fully seen to fruition yet. And what else? I think between the teachers' voices and Hetty's sort of ABCs of attendance, and reaching out to some people who are really trying to follow this, like Justin Reich at MIT, who has been interviewing teachers with his team of researchers, I guess, since the spring, and has a really rich trove of stories right now from his researchers interviewing teachers about what they saw and experienced in the spring. So that kind of gave me a grounding of last year. And I'll be really curious to see what they find as they move into interviewing in the fall. Let's see, what else? Hetty gave me some great ideas for people to reach out to: the Mississippi State Superintendent, the folks in Long Beach, California, who already had some really interesting interventions underway for absenteeism, and have been able to easily, make them apply to the pandemic and online learning. And that, I think, about covers my reporting. And then it was just a matter of stitching it all together. But I do think a next step for me, if I have time to keep doing some education reporting, would be to find some families on the ground who are struggling with this. And the kind of reporting I like to do most is out in the country, I've been a national reporter in Miami and in Boston, and as well as an education reporter, and now as a healthcare reporter. And that is the bulk of what I do normally, is fly all over the place or drive all over the place and talk to people where they are and just watch and experience and soak up how people are experiencing different parts of life. And not being able to do that right now has been challenging and kind of depressing. I was happy to be able to have some deep conversations with teachers on the phone, but of course it's nothing like going and sitting in classrooms or knocking on doors. So that's something I hope to get back to really soon. And that, for all of us is so important. So I guess that's my quick summary of this story.
Thank you. No, that was great. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to drill down a little bit on some of this, pick up on some of the threads that have already been put forward here. I also want to remind the audience that you can put questions if you go to the GoToWebinar control panel and type in your question. We'll get to as many as we can when we get to that part. I'm actually, though, going to pick up on something that was already raised. And in fact, I mentioned ahead of time, I got an email from a journalist today who said, I can't make it, but I'm really trying to find the missing kids. It's really hard when we say we can't just travel and embed in a community and go knock on doors and that sort of thing to identify kids who are just, by missing kids, I think the kids who are just not showing up to school at all. And there doesn't seem to be, any evidence that they're, in another school setting. And so she was saying, I could use some more tips on how to find and reach those families, especially given the conditions, as Abby, you say, where journalists themselves, oftentimes are not able to go to those communities.
Right.
Eddie, you have some thoughts to share on that?
Yeah, and I think some of our thoughts have actually been more towards the school districts, but I think journalists could use these tips as well.
So you've been advising school districts on how to help them find the missing students?
Missing kids, literally. And part of that is because one of our, when we talk about additional metrics, we talked about, this was starting in the spring, you need to have working contact for families and kids. And by the way, one thing, the districts that paid attention in the spring, maintained contact and outreach with kids and families, really kept up those interactions and used their means in the spring to find kids, are better off now. This is one of those things where your investments before, pay off later. What I will also say, and so I think it's, some of our advice to schools have been, one thing is to actually employ kid networks. So this is an era of social media. Kids are connected with each other. Like for my example, for my sister who's a teacher, she then asked all the kids in her class, do you know where these other kids are? Can you help find them? You can actually find ways where kids have networks with each other and look for each other. Or if you're in a school, so this is a little more school focused, you're trying to figure out. So one of the other things I would just say is that I think one of the things that school districts are experiencing is that there are some kids who, it's not that their families have actually had to move during COVID. One of the challenges of COVID is it is increasing our housing instability. Or if you want to participate, so you may be going to grandma's because you feel that's safer than, living in your home, or maybe because, and COVID's had a huge disproportionate impact on low-income communities, communities of color, the communities where there are essential workers, and that's connected to that housing stability. So I think a lot of the missing kid issue is connected to how families are having to move around in order for them to be able to locate where they can live, or there are missing kids who sometimes what's happened is around there, maybe they they don't have enough money to maintain their telephones. What I wonder is, and I'd also be really interested in Abby's thoughts about finding the totally missing kids, because I think often you have to go, you're going through districts to find missing kids. What I think you might need to do to find missing kids is then go through community agencies and other entities that have connections to kids and families, but the kids and families aren't connected to districts. So you would go to those churches, you would go, and some have maintained online, services, or you go to immigrant associations that are connected to families. I think it's that approach that you'd have to use if you wanted to find families. Aside from Abby, it sounded like you also had some ways of finding folks because as a newspaper, you invite people to connect to you.
Right, although that is a weakness of our call out process is it depends on people reading the New York Times. And there's a lot of people in this country who don't read the New York Times. And, especially people who are facing economic hardships or housing instability or et cetera, you're likely not to find as many people that way. So I am definitely looking at community groups and talking to some community groups here in Washington and in some of the different wards, some neighborhood focus groups who I know are helping families out right now who are in need with food or housing or, even technology for the kids to attend school. And I know that they're in touch with families who are having a hard time making it to school every day. Churches is another great resource. Somebody suggested food banks to me. But I do think as close to the neighborhood level as you can get in terms of community groups that work with families, the more likely you are to have success there.
The other thing may be social media for young people.
Yeah, I thought about that.
I really think that don't underestimate the value of using Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and kids are connected to each other.
Totally.
Kind of way.
TikTok is probably going to be the best medium for that. But I was going to mention I do use Twitter and Facebook and sometimes Instagram as a healthcare reporter looking for people in different situations. I did not, at least yet, in these stories, but I think it's a great idea. And you just have to figure out what social media platforms kids who aren't necessarily going to school are on in any given place or time. But it's a great idea.
Eric, can I also turn to one thing that I felt like I didn't explain so much is that this issue of what is showing up to school is part of the problem of metrics is that has changed so much. So everyone knew pre-pandemic. It's one of the reasons why it was one of the best metrics because there was sort of not a question. Either you were in school and you could see them or they weren't there. Now that you have, and so if you have in-person school, you can still do that. If you have virtual school and you have kids showing up, I mean, there are some layers, if Abby turned off her screen, is she, her video, her camera, do I still count her as there? If they come in late, but it's still relatively easy if it's a synchronous and virtual. You can at least tell whether a kid was showing up. The bigger challenges are as we've moved to asynchronous. So asynchronous means often a kid has turned in an assignment or a kid sometimes we're trying to figure out does log on mean that they actually were in the system, amount of time logged in. Those are ways if you have a technology strategy, but I will also say one of the reasons why it's so challenging is that data that it's usually something called a learning management system where that information about logging on, assignment completion sits. Attendance is almost always in a student information system. And we haven't yet created ways so that the learning management system easily download into the student information systems. And now you're adding to the work of teachers to say, oh, I checked in. And the other thing is sometimes assignments are a couple days after the class happened. So if they turned it in, then you have to go back and revise the fact that they actually were present. And then it gets even more complex when you don't have any virtual means, but you're just talking about homework packets. And how do you know when you've sent out the homework packets? What's your system for knowing the kids actually completed? And I do think in the spring, there were a lot of challenges with this. People have tried to be a bit more systemic, but this first month of school is really challenging as people try to take to scale these different approaches of taking attendance.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that is probably most of the teachers I talked to wanted to talk more about the headache of taking attendance right now than they wanted to talk about absenteeism, just because for them in the moment, in these first few weeks of school, trying to get used to and understand these new attendance systems and metrics and formulas that their districts had asked them to follow were kind of nightmarish. And some teachers said they were spending more time on calculating attendance than just about any other task right now. Hopefully, as time goes by and the school year settles in, they get used to it, but it did sound like an extremely complicated set of equations that they had to.
Well, and many people are devising their attendance guidance as school started. So it's not like they all got trained in the summer and you had a chance to learn these new things.
Right. They learned when they went for training like the day before school started.
Yeah. So, and I think we also have the challenges that it used to have more of a system where teachers were often more supported by other staff at the school who then could help. But we haven't necessarily figured out virtual, particularly in virtual situations, how do you really enlist the whole school staff in helping teachers do what they need to do? And again, the places that are better off are the ones where there's a quick way where teachers do something, and then let's say they can't find a kid, you can quickly hand it off to someone else who can then do the follow-up. So all of the burden doesn't happen on teachers, but this is still not yet in place. And this is one of the reasons why the attendance data is so challenging. And one of the reasons to look at first month attendance data is to actually figure out if part of our problem is we actually don't know how to count yet well because people aren't trained.
I think one question reporters may be wondering is kind of the context piece, and it sounds like, I know Hetty, you and I talked about this ahead of time, that there may not be a clear indication of this. Is, a part of the news peg wouldn't just be, absenteeism at the time of COVID-19, but also absenteeism is much worse than it was before. But I guess we don't really have good reliable data to compare. Is there higher absentee rates and, larger numbers of kids who are missing chronically than usual, or is that just too hard to answer right now?
We don't have the comparison data, and my gut says it's absolutely larger. That's what I would say. And our bar for taking attendance, again, is in a lot of ways much lower. Kid just has to show up for one class, has to, and maybe that's helpful for, you do want to stay in daily contact. That's how you stay connected to families and stuff, but it's not necessarily giving you as much information about how much exposure to learning a student is getting. And I still think we are confronting incredibly high levels of lack of exposure to quality learning, and it is unequal. The places where, and it's both unequal because lower income districts or some districts are not as trained for their teachers to provide high quality learning, while they're in the classroom, and low income families may be less equipped to create the conditions at home that allow for a high quality learning. You have 3 kids, 1 computer, no quiet space. So I think that the disparities are likely larger, but we don't yet have the data that fully shows that.
Well, it's interesting too, because you mentioned earlier, Hetty, that is it almost like there's sort of a snowball effect as well, that chronic absenteeism, I think you said, was already an issue that had a more powerful impact on low-income families, students of color, and we also know that COVID-19 is having a disparate impact for a whole variety of reasons. So I'm wondering if that's making what was already a really troubling situation even more difficult.
Absolutely. We're deepening the disparities because of the challenges. And it is both the connectivity, but also the health challenges. And, you know, if mom or dad is an essential worker and you're home and you're a high school student, you may be also helping all of your siblings to be online. So it is certainly, I think, an indicator. And this is, again, where I feel like having reporters take on this. We need to, we're all in, if anything, we're more in our bubbles than we were ever before, right? Literally in our home bubbles. We have to understand other people's realities. We have to understand the toll that the pandemic, the toll that the way school is operating may be taking place. I also think these stories of hope, where we had a webinar, I don't know how many people were able to join us, where we actually, Abby, were able to highlight one of the schools in New York City, El Puente Middle School. El Puente has been in contact with its kids and families, and it's everything that they're doing that means they have really high levels of attendance, even starting into school. It's the fact that they have a curriculum that's engaging, and they continue to have a curriculum that's engaging, that's community driven, that the kids see the relevance to their lives. Because if you're going to show up, they all, you know, you need that. They also have mentoring. So kids, and they did this beforehand, where kids who were chronically absent got a mentor. They do home visits. And so maybe they did them in person and physically distanced before, but now they're doing it with, you're doing it on Zoom as a virtual home visit. They created a system where, and this speaks to some of the realities that your teachers are placing, where they had, I think it's called a remote distance learning support, essentially. All the community school people, they created one Zoom link. Every kid only comes in all day onto that one Zoom link. The Zoom link is supported by a community school person on top of the teacher. The teachers come in and out of the Zoom link. They teach, and in between classes, the Zoom coordinator is creating fun activities for kids to feel connected and engaged. We can provide an engaged school climate, connecting, belonging in a virtual environment. You have to support it, though. It doesn't just happen. It takes intentionality. And if we can show those stories, so people are then saying, that's what we need for our schools today.
I think that's really smart. I just wanted to raise, I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, read Alec McGillis's amazing story out of Baltimore earlier this week, where he did actually connect because he had an existing relationship with a boy he had tutored, and told a very up-close story about one family's struggles. But one thing that really leapt out at me about his story was how many Zoom links this kid had to get every single day to log into different classes. And he had to have the app remind, and if he wasn't getting the text every day, he missed the link, which sounded insane to me. And just hearing Hetty talk about the one Zoom link, like, that's a great story and a great system that more school districts should probably hear about. And you're absolutely right that showing what works, and I've done this in healthcare too, can be such an important part of what we do. So I'm all for that.
I will say, it's funny. I think I'm struggling with this. I'll put it out there. I have a middle school age son who's doing all remote learning. And just this morning, he was 30 minutes late for a class because they had, Monday was school off. So this calendar shifted by a day and the classes were shorter. And he got confused between one class and another. So he was in the waiting room for the wrong class. So I said, oh man.
Classic.
Yeah. So there's got to be so much of that. I also have a theory about whether there's bursts of Fortnite activity at certain times of day, and whether we can connect that to the issue of kids actually paying attention, because, you know, especially if they don't have their camera on. Anyway.
As the mother of a middle school boy, I can relate to your questions. One other thing I wanted to mention that I do think is worth looking at too, and I'm sure some of you have, are these learning hubs that some of the cities have set up. Washington is doing it, like, through the Boys and Girls Clubs and some of the other community groups. I know San Francisco had talked about it, and probably a bunch of places are at least trying to do this. And I think it would be great to see how that effort is working out and how many people kids they're scooping up and what the attrition rate is like. Lots of questions.
Abby, one of the things I think that points to is, so for example, in California, which is where I live, we have one of the largest investments in after school in the country because we both have state funding for it and federal funding for it. And that funding has been protected, but schools aren't remembering the after schools are at the table, or communities aren't thinking about it, where they can both create expanded learning hubs, maybe in a different, if a school is closed, they could use school facilities, or you can use community facilities if you're doing a hybrid learning. We have to creatively use. What's clear to me is that the resources that just typically exist within the walls of a school are not sufficient to deal with the pandemic for so many of our families. And we actually have to take a whole school community approach. We have to map out our assets in a different, more thoughtful way, bring them together. So there's both things like one Zoom link, which actually doesn't take any more resources. It just requires doing things in a bit smarter of a way, but we have to be systemic about it. And other times it's taking resources where we might not have thought about it because we, deploying them even in virtual ways if we need to. You know, there's a lot of ways that we could be doing this, but we're not. It's about being smarter with what we've got.
Hetty, there was one question to the issue that you brought up earlier about comparative data. Why isn't there, can you just explain a little bit more about why there is not reliable comparative data about chronic absenteeism?
Okay. So couple things. One, I would say is a day of in-person attendance last year isn't the same. The measure of just knowing that a kid, the measures aren't the same. So that makes it hard to compare because how we're counting attendance is based on this whole mix of things. If you are in person and you're comparing to last year's in person, you are the same. If you're doing distance and blended, that is actually different measures. And I don't know that they're exactly the same equivalent. The second issue is typically you want to be looking at comparison over time. So in a typical school year, by the way, attendance is highest the very first month of school. You actually have attendance dips that go around the year. It gets worse around Thanksgiving. There's also particular days, the day after Halloween usually doesn't do very well. You know, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and then you kind of get, you have these winter dips, especially if you have hard weather. You really want to compare attendance compared to what it was last year at the same time. And you want to look at end of year attendance compared to end of year attendance. If you get, usually, for example, the first couple of months have better attendance than the rest of the year. If you only compared the first 2 months this year with last year, you're actually not looking at the full thing. So that's why you want comparison of time and comparison of measures. But I will say, we are hearing a lot, and right now you want to both look at attendance and probably enrollment a little bit, because enrollment figures are going down. If there are kids that aren't even in our systems that are losing out on learning time, but they're not actually enrolled anywhere. So I think we've not seen that before. That is new, and that is a consequence of COVID.
Abby, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the questions that you asked in your reporting, whether of teachers or others, that you thought really elicited some, you know, powerful responses that really helped inform the story and give it more of the, you know, a deeper understanding of the realities facing educators and their students?
Well, I was looking for data and I was constantly being frustrated because, as Hetty points out, there just isn't great data. So, you know, I did end up getting some kind of iffy data from last spring and a little bit from the first few weeks of this year. But really, I was just trying to get the teachers, as they got a little further into their school years, to really paint a picture for me of what it was like communicating with students and trying to count students through their computer screen every day, what they saw when they turned on their computers, what was their process and at what point in the day for counting up who was there and who was missing, tactics that they had tried last year with different missing kids to try to reach them. Mm-hmm. Just trying to get them to show me as best they could what their interactions or attempted interactions with students look like right now, I'd say was the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And that's how I ended up with my lead of the teacher outside St. Louis, just doing that count of the Zoom squares and who was missing after she had had a month of school and knew all the faces in her class for the most part, and knew how to quickly sum up who wasn't there that day. Right. So just trying to put myself in their shoes, I guess, and which is usually much easier if you're able to sit in their classroom or kind of shadow them.
Right.
I think certainly talking to like that state superintendent in Mississippi about describing, the asynchronous learning for all the kids whose Chromebooks were back ordered, and which is a universal phenomenon right now. And, how school buses were driving around delivering packets to kids in rural Mississippi for the asynchronous learning that they had to do while they were waiting for Chromebooks and might have to do all year due to poor connectivity or whatever reason. Mm-hmm. That was really vivid and helped me kind of just be there and see it. So I guess my best questions, and they always develop and get a little better the more you talk to people and mm-hmm. get a sense of what to ask, were the ones that helped me see through their eyes or through the eyes of kids waiting for that bus to pull up once a week or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think what else we want. We're actually just about out of time. One quick thing, Hetty, and then if either of you have any last pieces of advice for journalists about what to be thinking about or asking. But Hetty, there is also sort of like a transparency issue you and I talked about too. That some school systems may be more transparent than others when it comes to the information that they're looking for. Can you just say just a little bit about that for a second?
Yeah, so most places put attendance or chronic absence data on at the end of the year. What's interesting is the school districts or states, I know one at least that's talking about it, that are trying to put a lot of times it's called participation data or attendance data up now at the end of the first month, at the end of the second month. I think that if we can highlight and extol the value of that happening, it allows us to more deeply look at it. I do think that, and maybe this gets into my advice for reporters too, and then Abby can have the last part of it, which is one of the things we need to do is make sure people see that data is really a tool for us to get better. It is not for blame. It's not for blaming kids and families for not showing up. It's also not a time to blame teachers or districts or states for what they're not doing. We're trying to invent something that we haven't invented and we don't have sufficient resources to do it. Data helps us figure out where we're missing resources, helps us figure out where maybe someone's doing a better job. And we want people to feel that transparency is a tool and a support to them.
Okay, thank you.
Reporters can help make that happen would be much appreciated.
Abby, you have the final word. Any last things you want to share?
I guess just this has me thinking about all the different, because this is such an unprecedented situation, all of these aspects that are just completely, for the most part, unreported on right now that are so worth exploring for stories, including you know, how teachers are adapting and what makes a good online teacher and what makes for good online instruction is really fascinating to me, because there's clearly a lot that's not so great. And just, it'll be so important for education reporters to keep, to really try to dive in and figure out how all of these different facets are working out. And I hope to keep doing some myself too. So, and hopefully finding some ways to get out and talk to people, even if it's in a socially distanced way. Maybe not observing like we normally do, but just talking to real people, teachers, students, parents, about how things are working for them this year is the most important thing for me. So.
Right. Well, thank you. And I look forward to your next story on this. So I'll keep an eye out for that. And again, thanks to both of you, Hedy Chang of Attendance Works and Abby Goodenough of the New York Times. And thank you to our audience. As soon as the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete that. Your feedback is so important to us to help us improve. Finally, visit ewa.org/events to sign up for our upcoming webinars, including one next week on Tuesday, which will offer advice for journalists who have sold books, from journalists who have sold books, and we'll even have an agent on there to help provide advice on how to get your own book published. So that's all for today. Thanks so much.